welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah and today I'm back with my second instalment for my sort of rough reading around the world project. I ideally would like to read a book from every country around the world, but that's less my focus because there are some countries that are pretty tiny that there's maybe only been like a couple of books written, so I don't want to be picking up books just for the sake of picking up a book from that country if it's not something that I'm interested in at all, but I would like to try and read as diversely as possible. So I think that making sure that I'm trying to read books from all around the world is very important. So I did the first installment of this maybe a few months ago. I talked about all of the books I'd read from the Americas, and then I did a reading vlog where I read a few books from the Americas and the Caribbean. I'm not going to do a reading vlog for Africa, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this video, simply because I'm trying not to buy any new books at the moment. I feel like TBR is getting a little bit out of control again, and I only have a couple of books that are really only one book, which I'll talk about at the end, that is by an African author on my TBR. So yeah, I'm going to sort of put that on hold for the moment, but I do definitely want to make sure that I'm continuing to read more African authors, and I thought I'd talk you through all the books that I've read and what countries I've read the most from, etc., and which books I would really recommend if you're looking for some African authors and books to read. So yeah, I have only read from 12 African countries, which I thought I'd have read from way more. I think there are over 50 countries in Africa, so yeah, still quite a lot of countries to read from. What I found is that I've mainly read from French and English speaking countries, probably because, well, English speaking countries, they're going to be published in English. I've read some of the French speaking authors in French, and the other ones I've read translations of, but yeah, I guess some of the countries that speak other languages, they're maybe not as widely available in English translations. Also, when I did some research into different books to read from African countries, there are some countries, like some of the countries in Central Africa, where there really are only a couple of books available. So yeah, I've not gone out of my way to like particularly search for books from specific countries yet. I'm just trying to like read what takes my fancy. So yeah, some of those countries I've obviously not got to, which I guess makes sense. I was a bit surprised that I hadn't read more from sort of northern African countries. Like I've read a few, but like I've not read anything from Morocco, which is obviously quite a large country. So yeah, anyway, I'll talk you through all of the countries that I've read from and the books that I've read. So I've roughly split these up into geographical location. Roughly. So I'll start with the books from Northern Africa. So from Egypt, I have read Return of the Spirit by Tawfiq al-Hakim. This is a classic from the 1930s, and it was originally published in Arabic. I quite enjoyed this book. It's about an Egyptian family leading up to the 1919 Egyptian revolution against British rule. But really it's sort of a love story. This family's neighbour is like a piano player, which you can see here, and one of the men really falls in love with her, so a lot of it's that. It is quite like teenage boy sort of lusty type vibes, but it was quite good. I don't remember too much about it. I don't think the writing was anything too special, but I did remember enjoying it when I read it a few years ago. This is the only book I've read from Egypt, so I can't really compare it to anything else, but yeah, like I would recommend. It's not like one of my favourite books, but it was a good read. A couple of books that I read in French for university, because I studied French at university, from Algeria. The first one is Albert Camus' L'Étranger. I like Camus is Algerian. He was born in Algeria and he lived in Algeria for most of his life, but he is like of white French origin, so like it's not the most diverse pick for Algeria, but technically he is Algerian. This is a classic that if you've ever studied French, you probably have read this book, because it's very simple language, so it's quite easy to study in French. And at the time that I read this, it's not that I didn't enjoy it, I just, he's not a nice character to be in his head. So the book starts, it's like a very famous first line. So the first line of this book is very famous, and it says, "Today my mother died," or maybe yesterday, I don't know. So it's very much like, he's not a very likeable character. He seems kind of like apathetic towards the death of his mother, and then he goes on to commit a crime, and most of this book is sort of him coming to terms with that, coming to terms with the possibility of the death sentence, because that's still very much a thing in France, because at this point we were in Algeria, but it's colonial Algeria under French rule, and Algeria was seen sort of as an extension of France, not really as a colony, so that like it was properly like French law. Who's a very existentialist writer, sort of along the same vein of Jean-Paul Sartre. So yeah, I don't really love the existentialist writers. I think it's a really interesting concept, but I don't really like being in their characters' heads because they're very unlikable characters. But I would recommend this one. It's a nice, short, easy read, and you'll be able to find it in English everywhere. The other one from Algeria, I don't know if it's been translated into English, but this is Mon pere et femme de menage, which is my father is a cleaning lady. This is like a very short book about the immigrant experience. So it's set in France, but it follows Algerian characters, and Safia Azzedine is Algerian. I would recommend this one. It was quite like a nice, easy read, quite funny. So yeah, it's talking about her father who becomes a cleaner, and like the sort of shame she feels around that when she goes to school. And yeah, just their life living in France as Algerians. So yeah, I would recommend. And then the last one from Northern Africa is Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih. This is sort of a modern classic that is about this man who comes back to his hometown, and we hear about his life in sort of living as an expat or as an immigrant in the UK, and like what he did during that time, and yeah, how he deals with returning to his hometown. It's a very short read, it's sort of like a novella, and I would also really recommend this one. It's not one of my personal favourite reads, but I know a lot of people really love this, and yeah, I think again it deals with a lot of interesting like colonial concepts, and yeah, really good. Then moving on to West Africa, I have read a lot of books from Nigeria, which makes sense because English is like one of their main languages, and it's got a huge population, so a lot of Nigerian writers are published in the UK in English. So I will talk you through all of the Nigerian books first. So a couple that I don't have, I read Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. I really liked this book, but it's ultimately not one that's really stuck with me so much. So this is sort of, how would you classify this? Like a literary, not really thriller, but it's like a bit of a twisty turny book essentially. We follow a woman who is married to her husband, and they've not had a child, and her husband's mother is determined that he's going to take a second wife, and then he does so, and it's just about what happens from there. So it's very interesting if you want to look at concepts of fertility and marriage in Nigeria. I thought it was really, really interesting from that point of view. I don't really love books where there are twists or like big plot like turns in the plot. It's just not my thing. So I think this one is really good if you love like a thriller or a mystery, but not one that I like ultimately stayed with me, although I did think it was exploring really interesting things. I've also read Teju Cole's book Black Paper, Writing in a Dark Time. This is like a very small volume of his essays, looking at basically a variety of things, racism and writing and creativity and just lots of different things. If you like essays, I would recommend this one. It was a good little read. I would like to read some of his fiction. I know that he's written quite a few novels that get really have had a really good reception, so I would like to go back and read some of them. I also always think it's strange when you start with an author like reading their non-fiction, because quite often they reference their fiction or they expect that you like know their most famous books. So when you read a sort of more obscure like selection of essays, it's like can sometimes be a bit strange, but I did enjoy this. I also read a collection of short stories, What It Means, sorry for writing this down, it's quite a long title, What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky by Lesley Nneka Arimah. This one I liked. I don't always love collections of short stories, and I've sort of discovered that I prefer collections of short stories that are anthologies, so at least like you're reading from different authors, at least then you get like a selection of different things. I don't tend to love short story collections by just one author, because I find it quite often, I think this is what people like, that quite often there are themes that are overlapping, but I find that some of the stories can get a bit samey. I did like this collection. I thought there were some of the stories have stuck with me. Well, one in particular, there's one about some sort of like voodoo hairball doll thing that was very weird. So yeah, it's sort of, they look at some Nigerian folklore and mythology, and it was interesting from that point of view. But yeah, ultimately, like, one of the stories has stayed with me. I did read this a few years ago, but if you like short stories and some of them had like a more fairy tale element, and I would recommend. I also read An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma. This book was very sad. I did like it at the time. It is about a man who, he goes to, sorry, this is going to be a bad review of this because this was a while ago I read this, but I think he goes to Turkey or somewhere on a sort of international student exchange, and then basically a whole manner of bad things happen to him. And yeah, this is like a very good book if you want to look at social issues and the sort of difficulties facing people from less wealthy countries going to Europe, and just, yeah, the sort of privileges you have as when you travel as a white person from like a wealthy country, you maybe don't realize, but when I read this, I was really like, whoa, this is bad. But yeah, I quite a lot of trigger warnings for this, but I did enjoy, is not the right word, but I do think it's an important read, and yeah, I did like it. I also read Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. I would like to read more of Akwaeke Emezi because I heard people absolutely rave about this book, and I think it just didn't hit as hard for me as I thought it was going to. Sometimes that happens when you hear loads and loads of people talk about how amazing a book is, and then you read it and you're like, oh, I'm not. It's not that I disliked it. Like, I think if I hadn't heard all of the like hype around it, I would have probably quite enjoyed it. But I was like a little bit underwhelmed. This one follows our main character, who is basically, it's sort of like Nigerian mythology. She has basically, I can't remember all of the details, but basically she has, it's almost like she's schizophrenic, but it's these spirits that are like in her head, and it definitely deals with gender in a very interesting way. But yeah, I didn't think it was anything like incredibly special, but I know that Akwaeke Emezi is an author who's written like books in so many different genres, so I'd like to pick up one of their other books to see how I got on with that. But yeah, that's that. And I also read My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. This was like a very buzzy book a few years ago when it first came out, and it's a very short sort of novella about this girl whose sister is a serial killer. She keeps murdering her boyfriends, and yeah, it goes from there. I thought it was fine. I don't really love that sort of book. Like, it was quite tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't taking itself too seriously, but yeah, it's sort of like a very light mystery thriller type thing. Quite amusing, but like for me, nothing special. I've also read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. This is a modern classic, and I would really recommend this one. We follow Okonkwo, who is quite high up in his tribe, and then British colonizers arrive, and is how it all goes from there. It's quite a short read, but yeah, this one is definitely, like, it feels like an important book. I didn't love the writing style very much. It's quite like matter of fact, but I think it's a very important story, and it was a very interesting insight into sort of like Igbo tribal culture in Nigeria. Yeah, this is one, if you want to like learn more about Africa or about Nigeria, I would recommend this one. I also read a little short penguin modern classic by Chinua Achebe called Africa's Tarnished Name. This is really interesting. It's just about colonialism in Africa and the after effects, and how people think of Africa and how that's like incorrect. There are 4 essays in this. All of them are like maybe about 10 pages, and yeah, I would recommend this one if you're looking for a short sort of non-fiction. And then probably one of the most famous writers from Nigeria is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I've read Half of a Yellow Sun, which is about the Nigerian civil war in the 60s. I really like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's writing style. This one I liked. I think that she describes things so interestingly and builds characters so well, but like ultimately because it's a war story, I didn't like absolutely fall in love with this one, but I did really love Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is about sort of a young couple that meet in high school, and then one of them emigrates to the US and starts her life there, and the other one was planning to join her, but then it doesn't quite work out, and it's about where they are now, and there's a lot of like back and forward between like current day and their story from when they were teenagers. So yeah, I would really recommend this one. This one is a very interesting insight into what it would be like, what it's like to move from a country like Nigeria to the US, or probably like a lot of Western countries. Just like all of the little microaggressions and just differences that you have to deal with. But again, I just love Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's writing style. Like if you like really descriptive, slow-paced writing, then I would definitely recommend picking her up. This is one of my favourite books from the pile, I'd say. A couple from Senegal, I read At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, and this won the International Booker in 2021. This is a World War I story, but very different from any World War I story I've ever read. So it's about two Senegalese soldiers that are fighting on behalf of France. At the very start, one of them is shot on the battlefield and he's begging his friend to kill him, and his friend does not want to, and then his friend sort of suffers a mental breakdown and we follow him from there. It's a very dark, very sad story. We go back to look at their childhood and life growing up in Senegal, and then just what happens to him from there. But I would really recommend this one if you're looking for just like a short, really punchy read, very dark, very sad, but yeah, I liked this one. And then next is one I read more recently. I read this in August, I believe, and that's So Long a Letter by Mariam Abba. This is sort of about like a woman's life in Senegal. Her husband decides to take a second wife, and it's how she deals with this. She's writing a letter to her friend, and her friend has also had the same situation happen to her, but they both dealt with it in very different ways. So she's sort of discussing that, but it's a one-sided letter. We never get a response from her friend. So yeah, this is very short. It's only about 100 pages, but I did think it was very interesting. I think it was a little bit too short for me to really fall in love with it. But if you're interested in women in Senegal and what Senegalese society is like for women, I would really recommend this one. I read Such Sweet Country by Kojo Lang. This is one I read this year as well. I read this in July. This one was a really good read for me. Probably again one of my favourites. This is a book that like each chapter follows a different character. You do then get some recurring characters in the later chapters. We go back to revisit some of the earlier characters. But this just sort of paints a picture of Ghana just in the 1970s, post-independence. Lang's writing style is quite unlike anything I've ever read. Which is incredibly descriptive, and some of the ways that he like describes things are really like it's really hard to describe. It's also got a little bit of magical realism. There's like one chapter where one of the characters is sort of flying around the sky at night listening to people's prayers and trying to help them, so that was interesting. But yeah, like I would really, if you like sort of unusual writing styles where that's like a big part of it, then I would really recommend this one. And I think it paints a really interesting picture of Accra as a city in this time period. So yeah, I love this one. Lastly, I read Michel the Giant by Tete Michel Kupomasi. This is a book about, it's a memoir about Tete Michel's time going to Greenland. So yeah, that's the subtitle of this book, is An African in Greenland. It's all about how his life in Togo when he was growing up, and then his journey to Greenland. He then spends a year in Greenland and then he returns back to Togo. So yeah, I thought this was really interesting, both from the descriptions of Togolese culture and then the differences in Greenlandic society, and the way that he's able to compare and contrast without, like, at no point is he either saying that Togo Togolese culture is amazing or that Greenlandic culture is amazing. It's just different, and he seems very accepting of both of them. So yeah, I really, really liked this one. This is again like one that I would highly recommend if you like a good memoir. I thought this was really good. The writing is really excellent in it as well. He travelled in the 60s, so I guess a lot has probably changed in Greenland since then, but it was a really interesting look into their culture and beliefs as well. Okay, so we are getting there. So on to Eastern Africa. From Rwanda, I read Our Lady of the Nile by Scholastic Mukasonga. This is marketed as a novel, but I would say it's more of a collection of interconnecting short stories, which I think is why at the time I didn't really love it, because I was like, oh, this isn't really adding up. But I think if you go into it expecting interconnected short stories, you'll get more out of it. This is about a school, like an all-girls school in Rwanda, and leading up to sort of the Rwandan genocide. There's a lot about that in it, but without it it is explicitly mentioned, but you should probably go and do a little bit of research if you don't know much about it before going into it, because it sort of expects that you know what's going on. This was again a very sad book, but I do think it was very important, and it's quite interesting reading a story like that, but from sort of young girls' perspectives, instead of, quite often when it's sort of stories about war and murder, it's written from a soldier's perspective, but this to see it from an average person is it was really interesting. So again, an important book. If you're looking for something from Rwanda, I would definitely recommend it. From Ethiopia, I read The Shadow King by Maza Mengistu. This was shortlisted. It says longlisted, but I'm pretty sure it was also shortlisted for the Booker in 2020, and I read it at the time. I think I read it just when it was shortlisted, so very much at the time. This is set in Ethiopia in 1935, and we follow a young woman called Kivrit, who ends up joining this war. Basically, the Italians are trying to invade Ethiopia, and their Emperor Haile Selassie is trying to push them back, and in order to protect the Emperor, they have a sort of person they're calling the Shadow King, who will appear pretending to be the Emperor to confuse the Italians. This was this is a very sad book. It's about war. There are some scenes that have really stuck with me, and there's a part where they are the Italians are throwing prisoners of war off the sides of cliffs, which is very, very brutal to read about. I think that this book was trying to do a lot, and I think it just got a little bit lost for me. There are a lot of characters. There are bits where there are sections where it says photo, and then it spends 2 pages describing a photo. There's a chorus where it's I don't know, sort of told from a different perspective, and then we've got interludes. It was doing a lot, and I liked this. I liked a lot of it, but as a whole, it's not really stuck with me very much as a book. I sort of struggled my way through it at the time, not just because it was sad, but just because the writing was very descriptive. There was an awful lot going on, and I think it could have been cut back a bit. But yeah, it is a good read for Ethiopia. It is looking at a particular period of history, so I would recommend it from that point of view. Yeah, not a personal favourite. Then a few books from Kenya. I'm just going to talk about these two together because they're first and second book in a series. So I read, which one came first? This one, Dreams in a Time of War by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and then In the House of the Interpreter by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is a series of memoirs that he's written. He's written 4. Dreams in a Time of War follows his childhood, and then In the House of the Interpreter he goes to high school, and then it's sort of Civil War starts to break out and he gets swept into it. I much preferred the first one. I think I like childhood stories for one, and I also found that this was more told in a sort of way that made sense to me for a memoir. This one I found it a little bit confusing because we were jumping from him talking about football to his brother being in a concentration camp back to school stuff. It was a little bit, and maybe that's just how he saw it, but I found it a little bit confusing. But I think that if you want a good insight into Kenya at this time, I would recommend these. I'm obviously not finished the series, so can't comment on it as a whole, but it was interesting. And then one that I really loved is One Day I Write About This Place by Binyavanga Wainaina. This is a memoir of Binyavanga's life, but it's just really snippets from his life. And yes, he's a Kenyan author, but he travelled a lot throughout Africa. He was sort of commissioned by the European Union, I think, or by the UN to write. So he travelled. He goes to Togo at points. He goes to Ghana. He's in South Africa, and at quite key points of history. So we see like little snippets of that, and just bits of his life. And it talks about the difficulty of becoming a writer if you're African, because he decides quite young that he wants to be a writer, but if you're going to get funding, you need to be writing about certain things, and you need to be writing about like European colonialism in a positive way, or in a way that they find useful for you to get funding. So that was really interesting, about just not really the censorship of stories, but it is censorship in a way, because how are you going to afford to be a writer unless you're writing what they want you to write about? So I thought that was a really interesting aspect of this. I would really recommend this one if you're looking for a good memoir. And we are almost there. From Southern Africa, a trilogy of books that I will talk about very briefly is we've got Nervous Conditions, The Book of Naught, and This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangaremga. I've also read Black and Female, which is a non-fiction book that she brought out a few years ago, and I went to see her talk at Edinburgh Book Festival in 2022 maybe, and I got one of my books signed, so that was nice. 2022 August. I really love these books. This is probably one of my favourite series of books. In fact, it was in my favourite book series video that I put up a couple of months ago. And this follows, I'm so terrible with names. Like this book I really loved. I still can't remember the characters' names. This follows Tambu, and it's basically her navigating her life in Zimbabwe, which at the start of this is Rhodesia, and the colonial system. Her brother dies at the very start of the first book, and she ends up getting the opportunity to go and take his place as a student. So she gets an opportunity that's not like open to a lot of women, and yeah, it's about her as she goes through education and she grows up, and it's just such a complex she's such a complex character. It deals with a lot of issues of colonialism, and I just can't recommend this one enough. I think if you like school stories, you'll enjoy this. Especially the second book is set in a boarding school, and I just thought the last book as well was so amazing. Like, it's just such a good end to the series. I would highly recommend these. This was like one of my favourites as well. And then lastly, from South Africa, I read Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. This is quite a difficult read as well. Trigger warnings for sexual assault. This sort of deals with racism and colonialism in South Africa, and it's a very slim book, but it really hits very hard. So it's about a professor who finds out that his daughter has been sexually assaulted, and he goes to stay with her, and she's sort of living out in the middle of nowhere. It's about racism, it's about sexism, there's a lot going on. I did really enjoy it, but yeah, it is quite a difficult read. Lastly, I've also read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. I think if you're interested in apartheid in South Africa or learning more, I do think this is a good place to start. There's a lot of his personal experience obviously, but you do get a bit of the wider context, so I would recommend that as a good place to start. So those are all of the books that I've read from Africa. I think that there are a lot of common themes here, a lot about colonialism, and about dealing with post-colonialism, which I find really interesting as a topic, and to see all the different countries and how their experiences align and are also dissimilar is just, for me, like I really enjoy sort of literature. There are also a couple of books I wanted to just mention that aren't from African authors but are sort of about Africa. The first is Afropean by Johnny Pitts. Johnny Pitts is a British author, and he travelled throughout Europe looking at different African communities in Europe. He's from Sheffield, and then he goes to Paris, he goes to Berlin, he goes to Belgium, and he goes to Marseille and Lisbon, and he sort of talks about like which African communities live where and why, which I thought was quite interesting, like because of the colonial legacy. He also visits a lot of museums and gives his perspective on that, and some of the sort of African artifacts that are there and how they've got there. And yeah, I just think this is great, excellent travel writing, but from a very different perspective than a lot of the travel writing you often see. So I would recommend this one. And also, I read and loved The Shadow of the Sun by Ryszard Kapuscinski. He is a Polish journalist who spent a lot of time in Africa in between the sort of 60s and 90s as a political journalist. So in this, we get his essays from different countries. I think that for a white journalist in Africa at this time, I'm not saying that his views are perfect, but I don't think that they are too problematic. I think you can read a lot of it now and get a lot from it in terms of historical context. I learned quite a lot about the Rwandan genocide in this. There's a whole essay where he really goes into depth about it. A lot of it is just his personal experiences, but he jumps sort of from conflict zone to conflict zone, so there's a lot of history in there. I would recommend. A couple of sort of areas I would like to read more from. I would like to read more Black South African authors, because I'm very surprised that I've only read, well, apart from Nelson Mandela, I've only read J.M. Coetzee, which is very surprising, and he's a white author. So I would like to read some Black South African authors. I would like to read some more non-fiction from Africa. I would like to read The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, who's, I believe, Algerian, and he's talking about colonialism. There are a couple of other books that I've seen people mention that I thought sounded really good. I would like to read The Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Emecheta, who is, I believe, Nigerian. This again sounds interesting. It sounds like we're getting sort of female motherhood experience from Nigeria. And I saw Emmy read The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born by Ayobami Adebayo, who's a Ghanaian author. This one sounds quite sad, but also very interesting. And yeah, I'm sure there are loads more books that I would really like to read. I find it quite difficult to find African books. If you just look up sort of like the best African books, it's always Things Fall Apart that comes up, and a couple of others, but like it's limited. So if anyone's got any good recommendations, I would really love to hear them. A couple of books that I do have on my TBR, one of them I've tried to read, and that's A Grain of Wheat by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is why I went back and read his memoir series, because this is about independence in Kenya, and it really like throws you in, and you have to sort of figure out what's going on. But I didn't know much about Kenyan independence, so that's why I wanted to go back and read his personal experience so that I could then read this and understand it, hopefully. So that's one that I will get to, but I would probably prefer to finish his memoir series first before picking this up. Another one that I have had on my shelf for a while is New Daughters of Africa, edited by Margaret Busby. This is a huge selection of African and African American mainly authors. There are British authors like Zadie Smith. There are some Caribbean authors like Leonie Ross. There's like a huge selection, and it's just sort of little either essays or bits from their fiction, short stories. But it's about 900 pages, and I did mean I picked it up and I started reading the first few, and I'm quite bad at sticking to things when I'm like, oh, I'll read 10 pages a day, or I'll read one story a day. It's fine when I have time, and then as soon as I don't have as much time, I just like focus on whatever novel I'm reading, and it just goes by the wayside. So I would like to get to this at some point, but yeah, it's a mammoth. And then lastly, one that's not by an African author but is also about Africa is Ryszard Kapuscinski's The Emperor. I bought this like online, and it came in its like laminated library copy. This is about Haile Selassie, who is the emperor in Ethiopia. I don't know if this is classed as a biography or more of his interpretation of it, but this is one that I would like to get to. If I were to give you my top 5 from this list, like in no particular order, it would probably be Search Sweet Country by Kojo Lang, Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, One Day I'll Write About This Place by Binyavanga Wainaina, the Nervous Conditions series, like probably the first one. Just I like them all, but obviously you can only read one at a time, so the first one, and Michel the Giant by Titi Michel Kopomasi. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I would like to continue my African reading. And yeah, let me know if you've got any good recommendations. I would love to hear them. I will be back soon to do the Asian part of this. I'm trying to do it continent by continent because each video has ended up being very, very long, so just doing one at a time.